Hey there, welcome back to Tim Talks. Check this out. Today we are talking sauerkraut. Oh yes, my friend, sauerkraut. And we're making it from scratch. Let's get started. To make the most delicious sauerkraut, you only need two things really. You need a big 5-pound head of cabbage, which is what we've got here. This one weighs 5 pounds and 11 ounces. Knowing the weight is important, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The other thing you're going to need is 3.5 tablespoons of kosher salt or pickling salt. You want to use a kind of salt here that doesn't have any iodine in it because we're going to ferment the cabbage in the salt, and we don't want to kill the enzymes in the cabbage. Now, your next question has got to be, how the heck do I cut that huge cabbage into little strips of sauerkraut? I'm going to show you how to do that. Here we've got our handy dandy chef's knife, and this is a big old cabbage. You can see I'm going to turn it over so that the core end is exposed, and I'm going to cut right through that core. It's going to help me to cut this into 2 even halves, and then I'm going to plunge right down in there. Okay, particularly tough cabbage. Okay, great. Get right in there and slice right through it. All right, that is Tim wins against the cabbage. Thank you. Now, to make this, you notice here we've got the cabbage. We have a sort of a center slice of it here, and here's the core of the cabbage. We're going to cut that out. The easiest way to do that is to cut this in half again. So we're going to cut right through that. Hopefully this will go a little easier than the last time. That was really pretty clean. And even if it's not quite even, you can see I've got it in 2 things, and we just slice that right out of there. We're going to use that for stock, and this also slice right down into that, and just until we see there's no more stalk left. There we go. We're going to do that with the other half, and then we'll get started slicing the cabbage. I mentioned earlier that it's important to know how much cabbage you have. Here, now that I've cut the core out, I've just weighed it again, and it's 5 pounds and 2 ounces of cabbage, and that's just about perfect. We want to keep it around 5 pounds, give or take a couple of ounces here. The reason we need to know that is because the amount of salt we use is going to be determined by the weight of the cabbage. So this recipe starts with 5 pounds of cabbage, and if you want to do another amount, just divide the salt in proportion to that, okay? Now, here we've got 1/4 of the head of cabbage. This is still pretty big to slice up. I'm going to cut this in half one more time. Now we've got 1/8 of the cabbage here, and it's going to get easier from here on out. Anyway, we want to turn the cabbage away from us like this. I'm going to slice it thinly. Now, you could shred this in a food processor. You could also cut it more finely. I like a really rustic cut of sauerkraut. So I'm going to cut it like this, using my knuckles as a guide so I don't cut myself. And so I can also make the most thin slices like this. I'm going to continue doing this with the rest of this cabbage, and we'll be back when that's done. As you can see, that is one heck of a lot of shredded cabbage, or nicely sliced cabbage, whatever, however you want to think of that. The next step is pretty easy, but to do it, I'm going to have to divide this evenly between this and one other bowl, just so we can distribute the salt nicely. Next, over each bowl of cabbage, we're going to sprinkle about half of the salt. Okay. Here's the other one. Sprinkle in the rest. And we want to just blend it in a little bit here. Turn it over a little bit. The salt reacts with the cabbage and sweats the water out of it. And what we're going to do next is leave this for, oh, I'd say about an hour or so, maybe a couple of hours. And we're just going to let the salt do its work with the cabbage, and then we'll come back and we're going to put it into some mason jars. It's been about an hour and a half now, and as you can see, our cabbage has been giving up its liquid. It's shiny. There's a puddle down there in the bottom, I think you can see. And what I've been doing is I've got these pint-sized mason jars, and I'm using a canning funnel here, and I'm just taking the cabbage that is, and the salt and juice and everything, and I'm putting it in my jars. I'm not packing it in really tight, but I am filling my jars up, as you can see here, like that, right? Okay, anyway, I'm going to continue doing this until I've used all the cabbage up. I got 9 pints of sauerkraut out of that big head of cabbage. Anyway, now we're going to pour some brine on them. I've made a brine here out of 1 quart of cold water. Well, actually I've used 2 quarts because I've got a double batch here. 1 quart of cold water with a tablespoon and a half of kosher or pickling salt. We don't want to use table salt here because it has iodine in it. That's not going to work for our fermentation process. Now, I'm going to fill these up to about, half an inch headspace. Gently pour that in there. There we go. That's good right there. And I'm going to go on and do that until each of the pints has been filled with water. And here we are, all filled up nicely with our water and salt mixture. And next I'm going to give the rims just a quick wipe to make sure there's no debris on them. Let's just twirl them around a little bit. And again, you can see how simple this is. You know, today I was in the grocery store and I looked at sauerkraut, and you really want to read the labels because there's a lot of preservatives in commercially produced sauerkraut often. And the one kind I found that was just cabbage, water, and salt was $6.99 a quart, all right? I think if you do the math here, the cabbage that I bought today, I think it was 59 cents a pound. That was about 5.5 pounds. You do the math and then divide it by 9. That's what that costs per jar. It's cheap, and it's also just so good. Now we're going to put our lids on, and we're going to attach the rings pretty tightly here because this is where this is going to break into a good news and bad news scenario. Okay, now listen. There's good news about sauerkraut, and it's this. It's super cheap. It's really easy to make, and as long as you watch the proportion of cabbage to salt and that you make the brine properly, this is going to turn out just great. But the bad news is that it takes 6 to 8 weeks to ferment, and so now what we're going to do is I'm going to put the lids on the rest of these jars. I'm going to put these in a pan that has a lip on it so that if there's anything flows out of these, the pan will catch it. And we're going to let them go for 6 to 8 weeks. Now that I've got all the lids and all the bands on them and everything's nice and tightly secured, just one more thing. I said you're going to put these in a pan that will catch any liquid that comes out of them, and you're going to watch them once in a while. If the liquid starts to drain out, or you notice that one of the bottles needs a little liquid, you're going to keep on hand some of that brine, and again that's 1 quart of cold water with a tablespoon and a half of kosher salt dissolved in it. And you can just sort of top it off every now and then, and from time to time you may want to open the jars to release some of the gases that are in there. It's no big deal. You want to do it slowly though, because they're going to kind of fizz out. You don't want them spurting out of the jar. Again, check it every week or so over the next 6 to 8 weeks, and when that's done, I'll come back and we'll can this stuff.